Welcome, everyone. I would like to start with a question. When was the last time you had one of those weeks when you were on fire? Sharp, creative, confident, work felt almost easy. You walked into a room and you knew it. And then maybe 2 weeks later, the same workload felt like wading through wet concrete. Same you, same job, same responsibilities. Everything just a bit harder. You told yourself to push through. You probably blamed your sleep, or your diet, or your mindset. Maybe you wondered if you were losing your edge. But here's actually what I want to hear today. You were not losing your edge. You were in a different phase of your cycle, and nobody had given you the map. So this is what I want to talk about today. Not biology for biology's sake. Not another well-being talk that sounds great and changes nothing. This is about giving you a practical, evidence-informed framework for understanding why your performance fluctuates and what to actually do about it. I host the Biohacking Eve podcast. My name is Judith Mueller. My work sits at the intersection of biohacking, longevity, and women's health. And I can tell you this is one of the highest leveraged things I have ever implemented. By the end of this talk, you will have one specific thing you could try this week. That's my promise. So let's go. Let me start with something that almost no one says out loud in a professional context. The modern workday was not designed for female biology. It's not a conspiracy. It's not done with bad intentions. It's just that the 9 to 5, 5 days a week, consistent output model was built around a biology that runs on a 24-hour cycle. Sleep, wake, repeat. Same hormonal rhythm every single day. Problem is, women's biology doesn't actually work like that. Over the course of roughly 28 days, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, we move through 4 distinct hormonal phases. And these hormones do not just affect our bodies, they actually affect our brains. So now the need, or when I say the word hormones, that actually switches a lot of people off because we've been taught that hormones are a women's health issue. It's something to manage, something that gets in the way as aware. But if we look at what actually happens, so for example, we have estrogen and progesterone, these 2 main hormones driving your cycle. They actually interact directly with your prefrontal cortex. So that's a part of your brain responsible for decision-making, focus, complex thinking. They also interact with the amygdala, the seat of emotional processing. They regulate dopamine, which in turn drives motivation. So they shape how you think, how you communicate, how you lead, and how you recover. One important thing to bear in mind is they're not sex hormones, they're cognitive hormones, and we have been massively underestimating what they do. The result of ignoring this, we show up every day expecting ourselves to perform identically. And when we don't, when motivation's low, our focus is scattered, or we feel just flat, we make it mean something about us, about our work ethic, about our capability. The thing is, you're not inconsistent, you're cyclical, and there's a difference. And that difference is a feature, not a flaw. So research consistently links this hormonal mismatch to higher rates of burnout in women, increased mental health struggles, and decreased job satisfaction. Not because women can't handle the pressure, but because the system asks us to ignore our own biology every single day. So what's actually happening across our cycle? Let's look at the science first. There. Keeps disappearing. Fantastic. Okay, so this is what our hormones are actually doing across the cycle. The rose line is estrogen, so watch how it rises sharply through the follicular phase and peaks at ovulation. The dashed line is progesterone, so that's flat until after ovulation, then it surges through the luteal phase. And the teal line is testosterone, it spikes at ovulation alongside estrogen. So these 3 hormones together are what create the ovulation glow, the verbal confidence, the feeling you can walk into any room. And look at the luteal phase when progesterone is at its highest. The brain is actually different here. It's not weaker, it's different. Progesterone drives attention to detail and gut-level judgment. It's a different superpower, and underneath each phase of this chart, you can already see what that means for your work. So let's walk through each one. So again, there are 4 phases to the menstrual cycle, and each one has a distinct hormonal profile that shapes your cognitive strengths. I want to give you those strengths, not the symptoms, not what to manage, but what each phase actually makes you exceptionally good at. So think of this as your personal operating manual, one that nobody handed you at university or in your first performance review. Phase 1. Follicular. So this phase begins on the first day of your period and runs for roughly the next 2 weeks. Estrogen is rising and rising fast. And here's what matters: as estrogen rises, it amplifies your brain's dopamine system. So dopamine is your motivation molecule. It's what makes you feel ready, keen, capable of tackling a long to-do list without feeling overwhelmed. In your follicular phase, motivation is therefore generally easier to access. That's not a mindset shift, it's a physiological reality. Your stress resilience is higher, new information lands more easily. You're more open to risk and possibility. So this is your phase for starting new projects, for big picture thinking, for saying yes to things that stretch you. If you have something ambitious on your list, something you keep putting off, schedule it here. Phase 2, ovulation. Ovulation itself is a moment, not a week, but the window around it, roughly 3 days, is pretty extraordinary. Estrogen peaks, and alongside it, testosterone spikes. That combination does something very specific. It boosts verbal fluency and confidence. You're more articulate, more persuasive, more comfortable with visibility. So this is your phase for the pitch, the keynote, the difficult conversation you've been putting off, the performance review, the sales call, the board presentation. Now I'll tell you something personal here. I generally dislike photo shoots. I don't know many women who don't, but I now schedule every photo shoot, every one, on the weekend closest to ovulation, because the difference is actually not subtle at all. Confidence, presence, ease with the camera, it's a different experience entirely. And there's a neurological reason for that. Emotional intelligence peaks during this window. You're more aware of the impact you have on others, and it shows. So use your ovulation window for anything that requires you to be seen, heard, or persuasive. Protect it for your highest visibility moments. Phase 3, luteal. I need to take a moment here because this phase has an absolutely terrible reputation, and this is largely undeserved. The luteal phase is roughly 14 days long, so this is half of your cycle. And we've written it off as the difficult bit, the PMS phase, the one to survive. But here's what's actually happening. Progesterone takes the lead, and progesterone does something estrogen doesn't. It sharpens your attention to detail and heightens your gut-driven judgment. So your intuition is at its most reliable here. Your ability to spot what is wrong, a flawed contract clause, a process that isn't working, a strategic risk, is at its peak. So this is your phase for detailed analytical work, for ethically complex decisions, for deep editing, careful review, or any task where precision matters more than speed. Now, you may feel less motivated, and that's real. Motivation feels harder to access in the luteal phase because estrogen and therefore dopamine is lower. But that's not laziness, that's physiology. And the fix is not to push harder, it's to change the type of work. Small wins build motivation momentum when dopamine is low. Time blocking helps, routine helps, ticking things off a list, even a short list, generally helps. Give your luteal phase the kind of work it's actually wired for, and you will be productive, just differently productive. So just as for the luteal phase, half your cycle is not the enemy, it's just misunderstood. Finally, the menstrual phase. All sex hormones at their lowest. You may feel quieter, more inward, and that's appropriate because what is happening neurologically is generally remarkable. During menstruation, the left and right hemispheres of your brain communicate more efficiently than at any other point in the month. The analytical brain and the creative brain are working together. This makes the menstrual phase the ideal time for reflection, for looking at a problem and truly understanding why it's a problem, not just reacting it, but generally thoughtful, integrating solutions. If you have a strategic decision that needs real clarity, a project that needs an honest review, or a difficult situation you need to keep thinking about, this is often the phase where the clearest thinking lives. So every phase has a superpower. That problem was never your cycle. The problem was that no one mapped it onto your calendar. So if each phase has genuine strength, why aren't we using them? It's not that we're actively suppressing our own cognitive strength, it's that the structure of most workplaces makes it nearly impossible to align with them. When you have limited autonomy over your schedule, when meetings land where they land, the deadlines are fixed, and the same output every day is the unspoken standard, you have almost no room to work with your biology, even if you know it intellectually. There's also something deeper going on. It's a fear of acknowledging difference means admitting weakness. So I've spoken to women who know their cycle affect their performance and who would never, ever raise it at work, because the narrative has been pretend you don't have a cycle, hide your tampons up your sleeve, show up the same every day. And if you can't, that's your problem to manage, ideally quietly. So here's the irony of that. What male managers and executives see, what they associate with a woman having a bad week, that's one phase, 1/6 of her cycle. They never see her in the ovulatory window, the most verbally fluent, confident, persuasive version of her. They never see her in the late follicular, where she can take on anything. So your period is 1/6 of your cycle. There are 3 other phases, and each of them is a competitive advantage, but nobody's counting. The good news is that that's slowly changing. And the conversation about menopause, and has been a powerful conversation, has opened the door. Cycle syncing is now walking through that door. We're not there yet, but we are moving. All right, this is the part I most want you to take away, because everything I've said so far only matters if you can actually use it. And I want to be honest with you, you don't need to overhaul your life to start with. You just need to make one better decision per week about when you do one. That's it, one better decision. 10% rule. So I know many of you are thinking, I don't control my calendar. My boss books the meetings. My clients don't care what phase I'm in. I hear. And this is important. You don't need full control. Even 10 to 15% alignment has measurable impact. The goal is to find the optimal time within a suboptimal week. Not perfection, but improvement. If you have a high stakes presentation and you have any flexibility on timing, even a few days, move it to your follicular or ovulatory window. If you have a stack of detailed reports to review, save them for your luteal phase when your attention to detail is sharpest. If you have a big strategic question to sit with, journal on it during your menstrual phase. So I actually personally did this with intro meetings, so the ones that matter for relationship building, where first impressions count. I now make availability for those almost exclusively in the first half of my cycle, and I use a scheduling tool for that, basically Calendly, and that offers 2 windows. So it's 2 Wednesdays every month, and people either pick one or they wait. And honestly, most just pick one. It's a very simple system. And it does make a genuine difference to how I show up, because when you have 8 hours of calls back to back, it makes a really big difference whether you're ovulating or you're about to menstruate. So the grace piece. I want to say one more thing about this, because it's a piece I see make the fastest difference for women when they're starting to work with their cycle. When you know you are motivated to slow on any given day, not because you're lazy, not because you're falling behind, but because your dopamine axis is physiologically reduced in this phase, something shifts. The self-criticism stops, the spiral into imposter syndrome slows, and you actually give yourself some grace. And that grace is not a luxury. Self-esteem is positively correlated with productivity. It's in the literature. When you stop spending energy beating yourself up for something that is biological, you free up cognitive resources for actual work. So the grace in itself is a strategy. And one of the most consistent pieces of feedback from women who start cycle cycling is, I woke up feeling not my best, and instead of catastrophizing, I just knew. And that knowing changed everything. So you don't need to explain your cycle to anyone, you just need to understand it yourself. So let me bring this back to where we started. Those weeks where you feel unstoppable and those weeks where the same work felt impossible. They were not random. They were not a reflection of your capability or your commitment. They were a rhythm, a biological rhythm that your calendar has never accounted for. Now you've got the map. So follicular, start things, plan boldly, take on the new. Ovulation, be visible, be heard, be persuasive. Luteal, go deep, edit carefully, trust your gut. And menstrual, reflect, synthesize, solve. So you don't need to do all of this at once. You don't need an app, a new system, or a reinvented diary. You just need one thing. So this week, note where you are in your cycle. Notice how your energy and focus actually feel. So start building your map, your personal map. That's a beginning, and it costs you nothing except attention. If you want to go further, there's a growing body of work in this space. So cycle syncing tools, wearables that track biological rhythms, and entire episode of Biohacking Eve. Would love to welcome you to that. And I will drop the links in the session in a minute. But most importantly, I want you to walk out of this room, whatever virtual room you might be in at the moment, or, close this window, as it were, with one thought. Women have always worked with rhythms, tides, seasons, moon. We just forgot we had one of our own. You have it. Now use it. Any questions? Okay, no questions. Fantastic.
A question, if that's okay. We can. What's the best way for others that you interact with, whether they be on Teams or a one-time interaction in, say, a meeting with a vendor or a partner, to understand these factors and proactively do something about them? Or is it better to just not do anything about them if you're an outside party?
As in from the third party's perspective or from the woman's perspective?
From the third party's perspective. What should a third party person do, if anything?
Yes, I mean, I think if you're a woman, it's easier to, I wouldn't say, what cycle phase you're in, and that might be slightly invasive because some people might want to share, others don't. But I would just drop something, especially if it's easier for women, just say, look, I've come across this, I've heard this about this really cool thing called cycle syncing. And, there's an app for it and there's all sorts of things. Have you come across that? Have you heard of that? And then the other person will say yes or no. And if they're like, I don't know what it is, I don't care, then you leave it. If I say, okay, that sounds cool, tell me about that. And you can even go into a bit more detail and say, look, the cycle syncing thing is actually, I hear it helps me with my work. Or you can actually say, I've tried it and it helped me with my work. So if you have a colleague at work, or, could even, if you're male colleague, you'd even say, I don't know, my wife, my something or other mentioned this thing. Have you come across that? So just to broaden the conversation. And I mean, look, I know a number of female entrepreneurs who post their cycle calendar on their internal, thing. I personally am very happy to do that. But there's not many people who do, but there's easier ways to sort of ease into that without making it personal, basically.
Yeah. Great. In the startup community, which I've been in for 30 years, it's been pretty much common knowledge. Everybody works closely. Women to men was small, I'd say 20 to 30%. And now it's increasing, maybe 40%. But it just, everybody sort of knew. And it was a surprise to me the first time I encountered it, but now it's common. That seems to be accepted in one way in startups and in maybe military organizations where, again, you're close to, and I have some experience there. Are there areas where it's not yet accepted, sort of old boy networks that people don't want to hear about it, and women should just...
I'd say that the general distinction is US versus Europe. So if you actually, East Coast, West Coast, maybe versus somewhere else in the middle, that might be different. And corporate versus startup is a completely different world because people just have it. If you think about it, corporate especially is about the whole 9 to 5. You have to be very plannable in your output for the corporate to work. Well, in a startup, you're going to do something else every day anyway. So you're probably going to pivot by next week. So let's be prepared for that.
People understand you're coming from the gym because you're working 24 hours a day.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. This was fascinating and really like it synced with my minimal knowledge, but gave me a lot more. So thank you. How can we help get it out to more organizations? And also related, is it like HSA, FSA reimbursable? Are there ways to?
So there's one app that I know of, and they're called it's faceapp.io, and they're quite interesting because they basically map. So they take integrations from Clue, for example, which is a cycle tracker, and they use that knowledge of, the length of your cycle, what day you're in, and the variation, etc., to map that onto your Outlook or your Google Calendar. So that will basically tell you, rather than saying, you're on day X or in your follicular, it will literally tell you today today they've got 6 different categories that they classify. So I think one is, paying attention to detail. The other one is, again, being visible, etc. And then they sort of have growing and shrinking blobs. So you can say, okay, I've got to give this keynote, and then you sort of select for these 2-3 things that you want, and then you just wait for the block to be biggest, and that's when you schedule it for. So it just makes it a bit more, interactive and applicable. And they're actually working. This is, I know this is in the pipeline, it's probably going to be a while, but they're basically working on, in the sense that you will actually integrate that with your to-do list. So it will say, obviously a review paper versus give keynote, like write the keynote is different from giving the keynote, right? They're usually 2 weeks apart, if I'm honest. Or even have a review 2 weeks apart just to see, is it factually accurate versus how does it land? I know they're actively working on that. They're probably, I don't know, a year away or something from that.
Oh, excellent. Are there, that's great for optimization, because I'm obviously a big optimization guy, no matter what it is. So this is a new area. Is there anything comparable in men?
Yes and no, because in the sense of tools or in the sense of hormone rhythms?
Anything. I'm thinking myself, I think it's circadian rhythm. I'm really productive early in the morning, even before sunrise. Yeah. And then when it comes to 3 or 4 o'clock, it could be just 12-hour days, long enough. But I start to fade, and there's only certain tasks that I'm capable of doing, that not really deep thinking or deep writing.
There's a tool that applies to both men and women, and it's called Biological Prime Time. I can send you the article on that if I can find it. Basically, there used to be an app, but I think that's no longer working. But basically what you do, you spend, I think, 2 weeks or something. Every single hour on the hour that you're awake, you've got an app, and for 15, 30 seconds, don't quote me on this, you basically tap the button on your phone as much as you can. So it's literally like 15 seconds and you're tapping on your phone, and it does a count of that. And that is basically your reaction strength, which you would think is actually pretty consistent throughout the day, but there are certain biological patterns. For example, I know that before 11 a.m., there's absolutely no point me doing anything that's to do with cognitive or output or anything. So I go do my morning walk, and I do my yoga, and I do, food shopping, and I'll call my gran, I'll do like stuff like that for, my 2-hour morning routine, basically. Then from about 11 a.m. till around about 2 p.m., I have a very productive phase. So I use that for deep work. So before that, I could do, reading emails, anything that is low cognitive strength. But actual deep work, I try not to do anything low level beforehand, because it'll start draining your willpower for the day, but you haven't actually got to a productive window. So for me, 11 a.m. till 2 p.m., and then it starts again at 5 p.m. It peaks at 7, and then I can go all night, basically. So I know between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., then, I do my workout, I do my sauna, I call my gran again if she hasn't picked up, whatever it might be. So, but that you do more of the logistics things that you need to do anyway. But I don't waste cognitive time on that, because I know for whatever reason, I can't think then. But I also know 10 p.m. at night, if I'm still awake, then hallelujah, that this is when I write books. This is when I do stuff. So, but don't ask me to do that 10 a.m. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Oh, great. Interesting. Yeah. And we're all different. And last question, since we only have a minute left, I might as well get it in. How do you think, or do you know how this impacts team dynamics? people are on different schedules, rhythms, and maybe, you know, sometimes it requires you to be in the same zone, a bunch of people, to get a task done.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is everyone needs to find out for themselves. They are, you know, their daily rhythms and monthly rhythms that they have them, and just be very blunt about them. So my team knows. I mean, no one can actually schedule anything in my calendar before, I think, 2 p.m. And I usually try to, again, I've got two days a month where I'm actually on, where I do the intro calls. Everything else has to be pre-scheduled, has to be deep work blocks, etc. So that's already like a monthly schedule. Then the timing of the day is around my biological prime time. So that's also optimized. And then, I mean, it depends on how big your team is, but then you just hope you've got some sort of overlap basically between. That'd be helpful. But yeah, just talk about it basically.
Well, and you know, this may be funny or maybe not, but then if you're filing for an IPO and all the corporate attorneys are on the same cycle, and it happens to be the 3 days before the IPO, you know, do you reschedule the IPO, or does the boss just say, "Hey, come on, guys, you got your girls, women, you know, we gotta suck it up"?
But an IPO is something you plan for a little bit longer, so maybe I wouldn't reschedule that. Maybe schedule it in advance if you can, but then also cycles themselves can be inconsistent, right? You might have a shorter one because you had a long distance flight. You've got, I mean, I know a few people with PCOS. So PCOS, you can have from short to very, very long periods, up to like 45, 60 days. But they're also not regular. So you know what will happen at some point, but you don't know when. And I know that these women, every time they have a long distance flight, they know it's happening on the flight, because you're changing your time zone. You probably have a, overnight, or you had to get up early. You're stressed about catching the plane in the first place, which in itself is, any sort of stress mechanism. If you think about it, period is basically potential pregnancy abort, even if there wasn't a pregnancy, but the body's deciding. Interesting enough, the body doesn't actually know for a couple of days whether it's pregnant or not. So every single month it's assuming it might be, it's preparing for that. And it's actually, no, we're not, let's abort everything. So if the body is stressed, whether you're pregnant or not, it figures out, well, even if I am pregnant, this is probably not a good time to have a baby, to reproduce, to spend energy, because stress traditionally meant, there's not enough food, there's a lion running after me, that there's something else happening, some natural disaster. Let's not have babies right now, abort. So getting on a plane is a signal.